Greetings to all. Today we are having our 13th intergenerational meeting. The topic is human rights in psychiatry and exploration. I'll leave the floor for Eugene Ko. And hello to Victor.
Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to wherever you are. Welcome again to one of our meetings. This is an educational meeting that's run by SID, working group under primary care, psychiatry, and medicine section of WPA. So today we're going to talk about a slightly different topic, something that it's rather important. In fact, it has a rather big, huge historical context. It's been something that's been talked about even in the 1800s and so on and so forth, and it's been there. And with that, we have someone who's actually very passionate, who has given multiple talks about this, and for Dr. Victor Pereira from New York. And without further ado, I would just want to jump straight in because I understand you have something to present and to share with us before we go into the discussion. So I'll hand everything over to you then.
Thank you very much. And good morning from New York City. I'm using a virtual background to show you. It's an original picture of mine, as all the pictures I'll use in my presentation are all original to show you my city and also part of my home and my family. It's my pleasure to join you. I have heard a lot of things about you and your group. I've been working with Professor Kashkun in the World Psychiatric Association, and specifically in our three-sectional project on climate change. I've been working with IDIL a lot as well in the World Network of Psychiatric Trainees, and I will talk about that because what we have been working together is specifically on the topic of human rights in psychiatry. And also it's great to see Ramin and other colleagues. Ramin is also in our group on climate change. And thank you very much to Dr. Ko for moderating the future discussion and for introducing me. I'm gonna start sharing my slides, and I'm also saying hi to those who are watching this live stream or who will watch the recording. We know that it's difficult to be together across all time zones in the same moment, but also thanks to the internet, we can watch things later. And I encourage you to share the recording when it's done with other people, and encourage other people to watch it. So without further ado, my presentation is on human rights in psychiatry. They asked me to put this subtitle, an exploration. And I am a psychiatrist for my background. I'm specialized in adult psychiatry and also child and adolescent psychiatry. I have worked and trained in 2 countries. I'm originally from Spain, so also Mediterranean, like some of people here. And I've been living in New York for the past 4 years, where I did my training in child psychiatry. Currently, I am at New York University School of Medicine, where I'm a fellow with the foundation Alicia Koplovitz. It's a Spanish foundation that has been sponsoring me for the last 4 years as well. And I'm also a professor visiting professor in Somaliland. It's a country in the Horn of Africa. And also, I've been leading the World Network of Psychiatric Trainees. We'll hear more about it. And also, it was introduced by IDIL during your Zoom party last month. And I'm also part of the think tank, the Global Mental Health Think Tank. That is a group for research and networking. Okay, and this is a view of New York City from my neighborhood. You see the Hudson River, and this is the New York Presbyterian and Columbia Hospital where I used to work last year. Okay, and I have nothing to disclose. And so what I'm going to cover, I'll try to be brief, is first a background on human rights in psychiatry, why this topic is important, what is there, what are the main challenges. We'll cover more the barriers and challenges to discuss, to train, to advance human rights in psychiatry in the second point. Then I'll propose 5 areas of action relevant for psychiatrists, especially early career psychiatrists, trainees, and also students. And finally, I will present as an original contribution the global pilot survey of the World Network of Psychiatric Trainees, and I will go through some conclusions. This is George Washington Bridge next to my home as well. And this is New York City during winter. So the background is that we are living we are living rapidly evolving changes in the world. So they are facilitated by globalization, by real-time borderless telecommunications. We are also experiencing significant changes in mindset, in attitudes across generations, which have an impact in the way that medicine, including psychiatry, is being practiced. But our world is still plagued with all sorts of injustices, not only in remote parts of the world. We see injustices, New York City, wherever you live, there is injustice. Being these days also days of war at a global scale, days of pandemic, and this war, pandemic, and other global crises like climate change are being the main catalysts of poverty, of violence, and healthcare inequities, to which people with mental disorders are particularly vulnerable. And while we are growing in global awareness of these problems, feelings of impotence and despair are also growing. And in this world, doctors are playing both heroes and villain roles, being on the one hand frontliners in healthcare, in advocacy, being also experts in public health strategies that people trust in. On the other hand, in many places, doctors are also pawns and enforcers of oppressive governments and systems. And in this context, psychiatrists have a role as stewards of the intimacy of people, experts in psychosocial structures. And however, human rights violations are still prevalent in medicine and are particularly endemic in psychiatry. And it's always time to remember that old adage that with great power comes great responsibility. And we are, so as for a global landscape, what kinds of abuses, human rights abuses and challenges we are seeing? On the one hand, we see what I'm calling blatant abuses, so things that are usually in the media and people kind of have more agreement to call out, like many places we're seeing active incarceration, people with mental disorders, prosecution, legal prosecution, and also state coercive psychiatry. So for instance, we are hearing recently, and the American Psychiatric Association also paid attention to that, how, for instance, in places with repressive governments, like now in Iran, it seems that like the government is using some psychiatric institutions to send political dissidents there. And we saw that during the Soviet Union as well. So this is not something uncommon. Apart from those abuses, we are also seeing the effects of generalized human rights abuses, not only for people with mental disorders, but for people in general. And those abuses, of course, have an impact on the mental health of people. We are still seeing in many places of the world different forms of genocide, ethnic cleansing, religious persecution, infanticides, and many other abuses. But also in every part of the world, we are still seeing systemic medical abuses and all forms of practicing medicine and psychiatry, in some cases that are well-intentioned or that are maintained by structural difficulties, but we are seeing many abusive forms of coercion and involuntary interventions that in many cases are blatantly unnecessary. And apart from that, we are also seeing what I call abuses of neglect, right? So these are more than actions, are omissions. So we're seeing especially how many people with severe mental disorders are abandoned by families, are given up by society. They lack access to care, sometimes even to medical care, not only mental health care. We are seeing what we call also asylum prison pipelines. So for instance, in the Western world, during the 60s, there was a deinstitutionalization, for instance, in the US, in Europe. So these big asylums where people with severe mental disorders were living in many cases for all their lives. And in some cases they were abused or they were not well cared for, and they were closed with good intentions. But in some parts of the world, including the United States, there was not a good system to transfer these people, to help these people in the community. So many of these people end up in prison. For instance, in the US, the main kind of mental health care system is the prison, and that's very sad. And we are seeing also many forms of medical legal discrimination. So for instance, we knew that, that people with severe mental disorders have higher risk of mortality with COVID. And in many parts of the world, they were not prioritized to receive vaccines, to receive care. And also part of the global landscape is policy, legal frameworks that exist, but are insufficient or are not completely enforced or understood. On the one hand, globally, we have the UN Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities that is very nice in theory, but is not enforced in most of the world. In the European Union, we have the Convention of Oviedo, and there's also a lot of heterogeneities in national, local, hospital, center-based protocols. Some barriers and challenges to advance human rights in psychiatry are cultural and structural. I'm not going to go through all of them, but on the one hand, the main barrier to change is the status quo. It's always difficult to change systems that have been working for many decades. Also, another big barrier is lack of training, lack of education in this topic. There's also confusion, contradictions, multiple legal standards, lack of enforcement of these standards. There are structural barriers in the hospitals to change things. And also there's fear and stigma about violence among psychiatric patients. And in terms of cultural barriers, I would say there's, for instance, a resistance to change, right? A resistance to recognize that we all have a contribution in this problem, that we all have to blame for these problems. And also there are factors that are outside the area of psychiatry, so to speak, but there are anti-psychiatry movements that are also making psychiatrists to feel bad and to feel sometimes more resistant to change. There's also, when talking about human rights, there's also these cross-cultural discussions as to what extent, what are human rights, how they are defined, who defines them, if they are defined by Western standards or if they are defined with global standards. Is there any possibility to even define human rights based on cross-cultural considerations? To what extent some human rights enforced by the West are a forms of colonialism or not? So all these discussions are relevant. And so 5 areas of action that I will want to discuss very briefly: awareness, training and education, attitudes, collaboration, research, advocacy, and activism. So on the one hand, awareness, we need those of us working in mental health or training, studying mental health, we need to be aware that human rights violations exist, that are current, and that psychiatrists and that people with mental illness are more subject, more vulnerable to these violations, and that we have a role in changing the status quo. Second, training and education. So we need more theoretical training, more practical training. We need to develop curricula, and I'll talk more about that. And also we need to change some attitudes. I will talk more about attitudes later, but in terms of education training, we need to be more self-critical, more reflective, and to understand that this is not about blaming ourselves, this is about changing to improve our patients. And this has been always the goal of medicine and good doctors, is how can I put my patients as my first priority and change and sacrifice whatever needs to be changed and sacrificed, so I put the patient first. And some areas of education and training, of course, are violations, coercion, but also there are other areas that like stigma, like access to care, and history aspects, and also hearing the narration, the stories of patients. Are all of these are interesting areas for education. We need also changes in attitudes, in collaborations. So we hear a lot saying there's no mental health, there's no health without mental health, but also we need to repeat ourselves that there's no mental health without respect for human rights. And we need to get empowered and to empower our trainees or students or colleagues that we have to change ourselves from being bystanders of these abuses to be champions and collaboration with other colleagues. In terms of research, we need to understand more the extent of the problem, the ramifications. We need to understand the attitudes of psychiatrists, also early career psychiatrists. We need to examine the impact of violations of human rights in general on the mental health of people. And also, in terms of research, we need to understand as well that in global research, sometimes we may be contributing to human rights abuses if we are not very aware of who we are collaborating with, what's the data coming from. This is true that in countries where with systemic repression, sometimes the data they are bringing for research or from, especially when they come from certain minorities, can be tainted with human rights abuses. And finally, advocacy and activism. So psychiatrists and every doctor and every student as well has a role in public health, in medical ethics, in healthcare, social justice. Practicing medicine is not only about using a stethoscope or taking notes, prescribing medication. It's about caring for the health in general of the patients and the communities. And we cannot care for the health of the communities if we are not addressing and taking a role in addressing inequities, injustices that are making our patients sick. And a few words about our survey that was led by IDIL, the World Network of Psychiatric Trainees. The World Network of Psychiatric Trainees is a global organization for trainees, but also we admit students. And IDIL talked about it in the Zoom party last month, but you are always welcome to join us as students or trainees, whatever. So we did a survey to understand what is there and what is lacking in terms of education, in training in human rights across the world. So it was a pilot survey, but we got many responses from all over the world, including many low and middle income countries. And so some results first is that in terms of demographic, we have a lot of trainees and early career psychiatrists. And people were saying that they were kind of familiar with human rights in psychiatry and very interested in the topic. But also they were saying that their exposure, their formal training in human rights was very lacking. Their training programs, they didn't address this directly in most of the cases. And they were suggesting that they should definitely we need a curriculum in human rights in psychiatry. And this curriculum has to be varied, has to include involuntary treatments, but also has to include training in advocacy skills, training in, for instance, in climate justice, training in the rights of minorities, in racism, in a structural competence, and access to care, among other topics. And most of them were saying that there will be a lot of benefits about training on human rights, and but also some challenges like maintaining the status quo or not being able to focus, or sometimes even the challenge of maybe politicizing our profession. But also they were suggesting novel, well, not novel, but methods that are not usually used, but are very powerful to educate in human rights, like talking or having in their didactic sessions during their training, during education, having people with lived experience of mental health and even of being coerced or having the human rights abuse, talking to them so they learn from their experiences. And future directions in our WMPT research is to develop more systematic research to understand more differences across nations, cultures, and to develop a curriculum and we are seeking partnership with relevant organizations, including SEED and other organizations. So in conclusion, so respect for human rights in psychiatry and mental health is a fundamental aspect of our profession, but is still very much overlooked. Coercion and involuntary treatments remains a core area, but human rights in psychiatry is wider than that, includes also access to care and other fundamental rights. Further work is needed in terms of advocacy, research, awareness, training, education. And we need a curriculum for students, for trainees, for psychiatrists. And finally, the World Network of Psychiatric Trainees, we are leading an effort towards understanding and addressing the global training needs, and we seek to partner with you, with WPA and other key organizations. And it's a reference list, and thank you very much for your attention. And thank you very much to Idil for leading this work within WMPT. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a few things to ask and talk about, but before I actually jump in and kind of leading the way, I would like to invite the students with us today. Some of them, for those viewing on the YouTube, they don't have their cameras on, but we do have a nice number. We have about 10 participants here. Could I just open to the floor for you all? Any comments, questions, feedback, or anything that you would like to propose to Dr. Victor to just get the ball rolling and get a discussion going? Anyone? I think this is also in a way a reflection. Victor, just for context base, I'm from Malaysia. So on your little map there, the one that has the darkest respondents, we're all from there. And I could really relate to some of the answers being given that you proposed just now in the survey. What strikes me as curious, when we talk about human rights, it sounds fancy. It sounds like this is a very new, novel idea. Let's advocate about human rights. Let's advocate about the rights of psychiatric patients. But in reality, this is not something new. This has been ongoing from long time, historical time. I mean, if we think about it historically, Bedlam, where the origin, some of the asylums back in UK, back then they were already talking about human rights, but their human rights perception was very different from what we have now. Back then was patients just being chained up, being abused, being neglected, and to them human rights back then was being able to live in a more humanizing way. And there were centers in various parts of the UK that were already doing that to a certain extent, but very small amount, and eventually it moved. So my point here is, and this is where I want to get your opinion, that there's a lot of disparity between, and this is not related to the development status of a country. I think in the States, you will see the same thing. Even in Islamic country, you see the same thing. There's a lot of disparity where there is a wide range of human rights issue or solutions or advocacies within a particular country or region. So like Malaysia, if I were to give an example, some of our psychiatric hospitals are strong advocates of human rights. They don't use restraints, or 100% zero restraint. They're very proud of it. Others are more traditional. Coercive, involuntary admissions are still the very norm. Legally, we are allowed to do that. And that range very differently depending on which hospital you go to. What are your thoughts about this? What about your thoughts on this? Because we seem to say this picture as a very whole thing. Everyone must go towards the same direction. Let's reach this goal. But so much difference, there's so much variety, even within a region. So where do we start? Where can we actually, get
there are a lot of variations, and coercion in general and involuntary treatments are still the norm everywhere, and even in so to speak Western countries, or countries that are supposed to be spearheading human rights and be kind of more advanced, so to speak. So this is an endemic problem everywhere. And where I train also is as a good hospital. I don't have any complaints about that. It's a hospital that is based also in values and also in Christian values, in dignity of people as well. But also is using involuntary treatments. It has these protocols as well. But in terms of involuntary treatments, there are a lot of cultural challenges. In part is the status quo, but in part it's also a very complicated issue because, for instance, in these debates, when we talk about human rights, there's a possibility also that the human rights, what happens when the rights of different people are conflicted, right? So, for instance, what happens if the right of a person to kind of be free, be in the street, whatever, conflicts with the right of another person to be safe, for instance, because there are some patients in which, because they are very sick or they are psychotic, they may want to harm on other people. And I have seen that. We had a patient that we were secluding and giving involuntary treatment because this person wanted to harm a doctor in the hospital, right? So how do you balance there, right? And you cannot, and also another problem is also because there are a lot of structural issues, not only the hospital, but in society in general. Sometimes you may think, well, if this patient that is very disorganized, that is psychotic, and during a crisis is violent, it'd be safer. You think sometimes it may be safer for them to be coerced in the hospital while he's treated, and then after being treated, goes to the street again. Maybe that may be safer than going to the police, because if you are in the emergency room and you find this person, what do? Do you treat this person involuntarily, or you call the police? Because you're not going to, if this person doesn't want to be treated but is violent, you have to call the police. But what the police is going to do? For instance, in the United States, the police has weapons, has firearms, and we have seen a lot of times in which there's a mental health crisis, and when the police goes, in some cases, it's not rare, the person ends up dying, ends up being killed by the police, because the police, they are not about treating people, they are about keeping people safe, and they're not going to hesitate to shoot a person if they feel unsafe, right? So it's very complicated, and there are structures that are not only going to change or cannot be just changed with psychiatrists behaving differently. We need a change of culture, of course, and we need the psychiatrists to make steps towards ending coercive practices, but also we need other changes, other structural changes in the hospitals and in societies. We need to have a structure in the society to deal with people that are in an acute state and are violent, and to deal with them in a way that is safe for them and also respects their autonomy so much as much as possible, and also respects other people. So it's a lot of change. But also the challenge there is that when we think about these complex issues that have a lot of structural challenges, we need to also think, well, it's also easy to get discouraged, saying, oh, this is super complicated, there are a lot of systemic issues here, so we are not going to change anything, and even if I change my behavior, this is not going to make a difference. But we need to change that. We need systemic change, but to get systemic change, each of us needs to make concrete steps.
And this is probably an entirely different perspective, but when I was asked originally to moderate this, I actually rejected. I actually said I don't want to do this because of a rather touchy incident that we experienced in our country. So I can't remember which year was it. It was a very recent thing. This was something that we experienced. A group of mental health advocates came together in Malaysia and advocated for human rights in psychiatry. A lot of the materials used, a lot of the infographics used were pretty much similar to what you presented there, which is okay. They do it. They are famous to a certain degree. And then things got sidelined, things got very twisted. Along the way, with the words of zero cohesion, along the way of saying human rights must be respected, they started promoting messages of no admissions. We're not talking about involuntary admissions. They were promoting no admissions, no treatment. It says psychiatric medication. They didn't say it directly, but indirectly they were sending the message to patients saying that psychiatric treatment is harmful.
Mm-hmm.
And when we look along that line, actually, the people that were doing it does have a conflict of interest because they were running other forms of therapy back then. It got buried in the end, but that it left a very bitter aftertaste. It left a very bad scar among the fraternities, to the point that now, if you were to ask any psychiatrist to talk about this, we are kind of afraid. I might get into trouble. I might get linked along the line of I'm going to boldly say it here, along the line of anti-psychiatry movement, in fact. And I think this was also highlighted in your slides. Some of the issues, the challenges was sometimes human rights advocacies in psychiatry, if we're not careful, if it can be taken advantage, and it actually goes into the line of anti-psychiatry movements or even monetizing movements. And it's very, very difficult.
Yeah, it gets polar. All these debates get polarized very easily, and it's a challenge. For instance, in the U.S., we have a big movement that is the Church of Scientology. It's called church, but it's nothing to do with Christianity. It has a lot of New Age elements, and also a lot of celebrity, and also kind of a cult, a sect. Tom Cruise is part of it, and they both in the US and also in Europe, they are kind of strong, and they are kind of leading a lot of anti-psychiatry movement. And on the one hand, they are kind of subtle, and they go through messages that everyone would kind of agree with, saying, "Oh, we are in favor of human rights, of course. Yeah, everyone would agree. We are against all these abuses," and they put examples of abuses. But also what they are bringing behind is completely anti-psychiatry, right? They don't want psychiatry at all. What they want is, completely different story.
Yeah.
Wait a second. They are doing repairs here at home. And the cats are trying to escape. Anyway, the cats are under coercive treatment here. Well, no, they are happy at home. Yeah. So, but what I would say is, when the more the polarized are things in the other side, the more kind of reasonable we have to be, because our tendency will be to polarize ourselves and saying, "Oh, so we are not going to talk at all about human rights because this is kind of radical, whatever." What we have to do is be the voice of reasonability. And this is going to attract people. It's going to attract people with common sense. It's going to attract policymakers with common sense and saying, "Hey, we are going to be, psychiatrists have to be the ones that, along with patients and people with lived experience, we have to be the ones that spearhead change. And we have to be the ones that people talk about in terms of who is defending human rights. We are the ones who have to be, not kind of radical people that don't want any mental health treatment."
And it's very in line, I mean, with the latest Lancet paper, the one that calls for the stigma. It's very in line with that. It talks a lot about this. It talks a lot about advocacy. It talks about even the terms, lived-in experience is now the acceptable terms instead of saying patients with conditions. And I highly agree. So I'm just going to move the spotlight a bit to, again, back to you all. You have been very quiet tonight. Could the rest of you all maybe chip in? What are your thoughts so far based on the presentation, based on some of the things we brought up? Any thoughts, any ideas, or any questions in fact?
I think I would like to share something or like bring up a point for discussion. In line with what Dr. Eugene and Dr. Victor have just been discussing, another thing that I was thinking about is the implication of the cultural challenges. So I guess like in some countries, maybe the more conservative countries like Malaysia, for example, there are certain things which are a bit taboo to be spoken about when it comes to human rights. And how can we begin to address this conflict and this thin line of sort of verging on, going against the cultural norms, as well as, maintaining the human rights aspect of it?
Yeah, it's going to be always a challenge, but also we have to take into account that in many cases, well, there are two ways, but usually cultural changes are slow. And even if they are slow, you want them to be sustainable. You want them to be to last, right? So sometimes patience is needed with some aspects that are kind of more subtle. But change little by little can be made with little steps, and first going to finding the common ground, even with people you disagree most. There's a common ground, because very few people, even if you have very different perspectives on human dignity, on values, religion, whatever, but most people are not evil. Most people can understand kind of basic things like innocent person and must be respected. So find a common ground, and find stories, maybe first-person stories of human rights abuses that most people can agree to criticize, to decry, and use that to make little steps. That on the one hand. And also some cultural changes are also faster, and are faster with legislation. So could be good to find. So there are many changes for good and for bad, cultural changes that are driven by swift legislation changes. So for instance, there are many laws regarding marriage, regarding other aspects and reproduction, that in which the culture of the country changes when the law changes, even if the law first is unpopular, but there's a government, there's a parliament, there's a majority that changes a law, and then people start to get used to that law and kind of accepts that. So that could be the same with human rights legislation. It may be enough maybe to try to get some legislation, even if it's kind of very basic, even if it's baby steps, to advocate with the legislators to pass it, and little by little, and as they keep passing these laws, culture will change.
Just to add on to that, we traditionally like to think of a West and East kind of comparison, but interestingly, and I'm quoting someone else here, India recently passed their legislation on mental health. It is the way they word it, the way the choice they use to create that particular act has been seen as very futuristic, as future-proof. It has a strong human rights protection within the law itself. And this is very recent. This was, if I'm not mistaken, 4 or 5 years ago. So it's not really an East and West thing. It's more of a will. It's more about whether people are willing to, go ahead and make the steps. One more thing to add on to that is that a lot of so-called cultural kind of overlaps religion, especially within the Eastern perspective. And most religions are good, good in nature. They are going to ask you to be kind to another. They are going to ask you to be compassionate to others. It's just that along the way, religion tends to be a bit twisted somewhere by humans, and that's where we get the resistance. That's where we get some of the issues.
Yeah. For instance, religion, it gets mixed with politics, with traditions, but in general, for what I know, but usually the biggest in the world, the biggest religious traditions had a story as well of defending human rights and defending the dignity of people with mental health disorders. For what I know, at least in Europe and in the Middle East, We know that Christianity and Islam were the movements that started the first mental health hospitals. The first mental health hospitals in the world were created by Muslims and also by Christians in Europe. So there's a lot of there's a seed there of agreement that people with human rights, they are vulnerable and they need the best care, and is the most humane action is to take care of them who are the most vulnerable people.
I'm going to make a twist here now. So you all as newly graduates and also students yourself, how would you all want to learn about human rights then? I mean, Dr. Victor has gave a lot of suggestions, but practically, if we were to hear from you all, how would you all want to learn about human rights in psychiatry? How would you want, of course, would you all be interested? I'm guessing most people is going to say yes inside a very public place, but yeah, how would you want to learn about human rights?
Yeah, right now, mostly will be what I call extracurricular, right? Because they are not going to teach you much, at least specifically in training programs. They will teach some things indirectly, but so most of it, you'll need to learn it by yourself. And there are many opportunities. So for instance, very specifically human rights in psychiatry, there's now a training platform developed by the UN, by the World Health Organization, that is called Quality Rights. You can search it on Google, Quality Rights. And so this is basically the WHO has been for many years trying to promote the Convention of the Rights of People with Disabilities in the healthcare setting. And they have published a lot of materials, and recently they create an online training, and it's free and everyone can take this training. I don't know how many hours it takes. I don't think it's too much. It's very accessible, and this could be a good start because it's very organized. And apart from that, search on PubMed. There are a lot of review articles. And also if you go to conferences, to congresses, there are more and more discussions on the topic. For instance, in the WPA that was in Thailand this last summer, there were many sessions about that. So go there and search these kind of opportunities.
In fact, I would go on to actually even recommend a book. This is a new book that was just launched. Brendan Kelly, a psychiatrist from Ireland. He wrote a book called In Search of Madness. The whole book is essentially about human rights and psychiatry and the history of it, which is a really interesting read if you all want to read up on that also. I'm just going to open up to the floor again. Anyone wants to say something or ask questions?
First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Pereira for his incredible presentation. And I think this topic, human rights, is very important, not for the health not for the doctors, but for all the people, because there is a huge stigma and prejudgments against their mental health, with the persons with the mental health disorders. And also we have talked about the cultural aspect and the religious aspect of the human rights in mental health. But also I think there is one more important aspect too, which is economical aspect, because there are hundreds of countries and there are some development countries in which people can get help. People can get health providers very easily, but for example, in the third world countries, people can't even have their rights to access to clean water, access to food, etc. And in those countries, the mental health is not prioritized. I mean, it is very backgrounded, so that's why it's not even talked about. In developed countries, we can talk about human rights and mental health. But in those countries, the poverty that live in poverty, the human rights and mental health isn't even a topic. I think what can be done in those countries?
Yeah, indeed. So the social determinants of health and mental health, especially the financial determinants, are very important. We also see that in the US and the Western world. Now I'm talking more about the US because it's now my home. It's been for several years. A city like New York that is very big and also kind of very romanticized in literature, in movies, and everything. But there's a lot of misery in New York City. Sometimes more misery that you can, things that you usually don't find at home when you go to the street. But every day I find a lot of misery. Very frequently I find people injecting heroin in open air. There's a lot of misery here, and there are a lot of people that are in the sidelines of and all these financial aspects, and especially the not having a job and therefore not having a good quality insurance, healthcare insurance. This really determines the access to care, and this really determines the discrimination they are going to experience as well, and the abuses they are going to experience. So definitely taking a look into the financial aspects is very important. And also taking a look into the financial aspects can be also an incentive for governments to create policies that include people with mental disabilities. We know that even people with very severe mental disorders, many cases with good treatment, that treatment doesn't need to be very expensive. But with good treatment, these people can live a decent life, can work, can even be very successful at work. So financially, we should have an incentive, governments should have an incentive. It's much better financially also for this government thinking pragmatically. It's not the most important way we'll think about, because we have to think of dignity. But even if we would only think about money, government should be interested in having people with severe mental disorders working and being productive, rather than having them in prison where they have to pay for them to maintain them. So there's a lot of incentive in promoting human rights in psychiatry, promoting access to care.
Can I add something on that? Mifida, I think that was a really good question. And I think like another perspective that I'd just like to add is, access to mental health care is a human right, but also just realizing, like actualizing the human rights of people also contributes to their mental health. So I think in low and middle income or like low income countries, like you said, that communities that are under resourced, I think the act of like just starting from providing the necessary resources, such as like access to sanitation or access to education, is also something that contributes to mental health by reducing inequalities. So I think, yeah, that's why I think like as aspiring psychiatrists and medical students passionate about mental health and psychiatry, our focus should not be only like, advocating about human rights within the field or scope of our practice, but also like advocating for human rights in general, because reducing structural inequalities is something that contributes to mental health. So thank you for bringing that up. It was a wonderful question, and thank you, Victor, for your answer.
I think at the end of the day, a lot of psychiatry education teaches everyone to learn how to use the DSM-5 or ICD. But at the core itself, I would feel is actually focusing heavily on society, on social related materials, and pretty much all the points that was highlighted is going to make an impact on mental health, is going to make an impact on mental illness, and again, for today's topic, is going to impact human rights within psychiatry itself. And to me, it kind of changes the whole idea, the whole perspective. It's no longer about let's focus on how to diagnose one illness. Instead, it goes into a much, much bigger picture then. And this is where I think I would highly agree with that last few slides that Dr. Victor mentioned. Every doctor should be an advocate. Every doctor should look into social related determinants, because it is going to impact the work we do. It is going to impact whether someone's going to develop mental illness. It is going to impact how someone is going to experience and recover or not recover from those illnesses, which in turn has those ideas, human rights, stigma, and all those will surface.
Yeah, and it has these names of advocacy, activism, but it's part of medicine because, well, it fits in many aspects of medicine, but it fits very well in prevention. And doctors have to work on prevention and psychiatry. Traditionally, well, not traditionally, in the past, medicine, holistic medicine, Greek medicine, and mental health care had a lot of prevention as well. But in the last 100 years, kind of psychiatry was more, well, first was more about just taking care of people that were incurable, so to speak, but now is kind of treating acute cases, but we have not paid much attention to prevention, and that's the key. And respecting the human rights of people, respecting and improving the social determinants of health is part of this prevention.
I actually do hope that eventually we will shift towards that direction. I'm being very hopeful and optimistic, and well, yeah, step by step, baby steps. So.
Yes.
All right, so we are almost coming to a close to our time. Would there be any, if I go around and ask the names, and would you all want to add on to anything, or but I don't want to put you in a hot spot. So anyone has anything to add on? Bulan, you wanted?
Yeah. First, I would like to thank Victor. Really, it has been a very productive, very impressive presentation. You have touched almost all the important points. And the study carried out, I think, by IDIL also seems to be a very important one. If I have not misunderstood that was related with early career psychiatrists. Was that?
Yeah, it's about education, ideas on education, and it was focused on trainees and early career psychiatrists, especially. Yes.
Yeah. I would like to underline the issue of human relations. Of course, this human rights is maybe just a topic under human relations. If people have some kind of respect to each other, if they can listen to each other, if they can try to understand, I don't want to use some classical words, but the basic standpoint is, I think, relations. And coming to, that was a good question, I think, what Eugene asked. He said, what would you like to learn first about this? Our student colleagues did not focus on that, if I have not missed. And there is also another point, which I'm not much aware of. What do the politicians, decision makers, think about this human rights issues? Maybe there may be some documents about that. Probably there are. I'm not aware of them much.
Yeah.
Is there a similar study like the one you carried out with early career psychiatrists to different groups of populations? For example, teachers, for example, armed forces, people taking place in armed forces. You mentioned the police. Police is everywhere, police, we know. And that may be rationalized, but what do they really think about what their feelings are? And maybe a small question might be added to this I don't know, information gathering, if they themselves have had any mental problem, or if they have any person in their family with mental health problems. Because I have worked in different areas, and I recall that people try to understand things when they face them, when they have personal problems with them. Again, thank you a lot, Victor, and the other colleagues who have contributed. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. And just a quick note, yeah, we indeed need to do a lot of work with the society in general, and also help other people in society to understand. Sometimes they think that dealing with people with severe mental disorders is something that just the psychiatrists have to do, right? And this is a responsibility for everyone. But yeah, working with interdisciplinary with other people. Now I'm starting the first course for school teachers in Spain about mental health in children and adolescents. And it's important to also to understand what they, and to help them understand that caring for the mental health of people is something for everyone. So thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much. I think our time is coming to almost to our markup. Perhaps any last final questions from the floor? Nope. All right, so we just spent the last 1 hour talking about human rights, and we saw a nice presentation from Dr. Victor, and I think that it highlighted, our discussion kind of highlighted a lot of things that still needs to be done, but it is definitely doable and workable. It's just remain hopeful, take baby steps and head towards it. Eventually, I think we will see the progress, and we will in fact see the progress as it goes along. I'm very, very impressed with the work that Idil and Dr. Victor, you have been doing with the groups that you are in. And I wish you all the very best in that. I really do hope you still carry on with it. This is something we really, really need more to be done. It's not something that we commonly hear about, and I'm very much looking forward to it. And I will hand it over back to Dr. Bulan. Then, would you have any final closing remarks or anything?
Not actually, but before closing, I would like to. I agree with you. You didn't want to call names and invite people to participate, but there are, as far as I understand, 3 students with closed cameras, and 1 at least not said anything, Irem. Just before closing, if you don't mind, Eugene, I'm not as polite as you. I would like to ask specifically to the students, if they are listening, they don't have to open their cameras, but if they want, they can tell what they want to say.
Hello, I'm Jimena from Mexico, and I think it was a really interesting topic. And I live in a country where human rights we still have a lot of work to do, and in mental health too. So thank you very much I have learned a lot, and I have the initiative to start working here in my country too about this topic. So thank you very much for the lesson.
Muchas gracias, Jimena. Thank you.
Thanks, Jimena.
So maybe I can add a few words too. First of all, thank you for this presentation, Dr. Victor. I think that during our medical education, we are most likely tend to think like we should learn the medical part and the treatment, everything. And I think it can be sometimes difficult to see the patient as a whole. I mean, they have their social lives, their family, their rights, their public problems and everything. But in the hospital, I mean, at least for myself, I think the patient like, there's a medical problem and we should solve this. I mean, I think it's important to address to the other aspects of the patients, and for a medical student too, we should see a patient as a complete, and we should think about their rights and their social problems and everything. So it was a great presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, think of, as the students, think first holistically on the patient, and also think holistically of the system, of the society, of the community. And thank you very much. I'll have to join another meeting now, because we are also doing research here locally to partner with the community, precisely in this case, partner with the churches to bring mental health to bring the link between religion, mental health, and also bring mental health to minorities that are very much united by their churches here in the United States. So think of the communities as well. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Victor, for your sharing and everything. It's been a very fruitful discussion. So we'll see you. We definitely will see you soon again. Take care.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Bye.
Bye. All right, I think this would be the end for today's session too. And thank you for everyone. This will be a monthly event for those who's watching the recording. And if you would like, you could always join us on the 10th or every month. We will have a different topic, ideally.